Some of the most horrendous images coming out of Gaza in recent weeks have been the white phosphorus munitions raining down on heavily populated civilian areas. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have documented Israel's use of this weapon, not just in Gaza, but also in southern Lebanon as well. Andrew, can you tell us what is white phosphorus? Why is it so controversial? And how is Israel getting away with using it?
So white phosphorus is classified as a chemical weapon. The sorts of weapons, amongst others, that Saddam Hussein was claimed to have in Iraq, but actually turned out not having. White phosphorus is a substance that gets dropped on populations, often civilian populations, as we're seeing in Gaza. And it can get dropped in multiple forms. But what is common to it is the chemical substance that as soon as it comes into contact with the human body, simply burns and eviscerates human flesh. So it leads to very widespread, obviously, because of its nature as a chemical and as a powder substance. It can be spread very widely. It can be spread unintentionally through weather conditions. But the sorts of injuries that it inflicts on people and the sorts of ways in which it kills people are incredibly, incredibly grotesque, to the extent that it has sometimes been described as a weapon of torture, even if it ultimately kills. So that the process of death is a process of an incredibly tortured, painful death. And when you have a substance like this being dropped on an area, it is impossible for people to protect themselves from it. And there is a global convention against the use of white phosphorus, which most countries in the world sign up to. The irony in this case is that countries like our own, Britain, signs the convention and therefore claims not to use white phosphorus and not to sell white phosphorus. Whereas in the United States of America, they have agreed supposedly not to use white phosphorus, but American companies are allowed to manufacture and sell it.
We are concerned by the reports of the use of white phosphorus. Obviously, there is a legitimate military use for white phosphorus, but that does not include using them on civilians. It means that if you use them, you have to do everything you can to minimize civilian harm. Anytime that we provide items like white phosphorus or really anything to another military, we do it with the expectation that it will be used for legitimate purposes and in full keeping with international humanitarian law.
And in fact, there is a small area in the southern states of the United States of America that has 3 white phosphorus producing companies.
Pine Bluff Arsenal has the only white phosphorus filling plant in North America.
And most of their sales are targeted towards Israel. And why Israel? Because Israel, more than any other country in the world, uses such vast quantities of white phosphorus, specifically in Gaza and the occupied territories, and has for many years now. But of course, during the latest horrific incursion into Gaza, there have been numerous sightings of and recordings of the use of white phosphorus that is probably sourced from these southern state factories.
When we've seen Russia using what appears to be white phosphorus in Ukraine and also in Syria, the UK government quite rightly has very vociferously condemned the use of that weapon by Russia. But something I found in my own research is that the UK, the British Army, has itself been firing white phosphorus, and the place where it seems to go and do it around 3 times a year is in Kenya, in a very, it's a remote part of northern Kenya, but it's inhabited by nomadic people. The white phosphorus is fired on communal land on a firing range which covers a vast area around which there is no fence. And these nomadic cattle herders, predominantly from the Samburu community, they graze their cattle across this land, and that's being showered in white phosphorus. The UK military says that it's acceptable to do this because they give out warnings not to go in the area. but the people I've spoken to didn't know that the weapon was being used there. This was something that Declassified, we were the first to reveal. It's caused outcry in Kenya, but hardly been reported here at all in the UK media. And there's actually a parliamentary inquiry in Kenya and into the British Army's activities there. And this is one of the specific issues that they are going to look at. So this is, again, this kind of double standard that we see when it comes to the arms trade. The UK say, well, it's an incendiary weapon, but if it's used to provide illumination for troops in an area where there aren't civilians, it's acceptable. Therefore, they can use it in northern Kenya. But we've pointed out that, in fact, there are nomadic communities that do graze through that land. We found British Army documents that actually acknowledge that that is how the firing range is used by the local communities. So is that something that would worry you?
I mean, I remember reading your reports on this, and it's terrifying to think that this is a form of neo-colonialism in which Britain thinks it has a need to test certain types of weapons that, as I said, are outlawed largely internationally and only used by what we're supposed to call rogue states. But here we have a situation where not only the fact, terrifyingly, that nomadic communities would use these areas and would therefore, without any shadow of a doubt, be affected by the use of white phosphorus. Not only would their livestock be affected in awful ways, themselves and their families would be affected, and of course the environment will be very seriously degraded, meaning that those areas become effectively uninhabitable. And for the United Kingdom to be doing that in a country that has the sort of issues around poverty and survival that Kenya has is totally indefensible. But it does speak to the almost sociopathic nature of Britain's arms trade and how Britain is prepared to justify things that it condemns utterly and unequivocally when undertaken by other governments. And this, of course, is brought to a head by the criticisms that have been directed at Vladimir Putin and Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. And like you, I agree that those are entirely legitimate criticisms. And we are seeing a situation where the British military, with the full backing of the government, because we need to understand that the military is a quite intrinsic part of the British state. And what the military does is a reflection of what its government allows it and enables it to do. And everything that has been criticized in Ukraine, that has been perpetrated by Russia, we have seen to some extent taking place in Yemen since March of 2015, and now in perhaps the most appalling, syncopated attack on a society that we have seen in Gaza, in which there is at the moment a higher proportion of civilian casualties than at any time since the beginning of the 1900s. And our government, having criticized Putin for the bombing of schools, of hospitals, of places of residence, of civilian economic infrastructure, are refusing to criticize Israel for doing it on a much more extreme scale in Gaza and using British weapons to do it. And then to again see, as you say, the use of illegal substances like white phosphorus. And in that instance, Britain can't criticize because of exactly what you've pointed out it's doing in Kenya. So we have the hypocrisy of the British state at its finest. And it makes us completely irrelevant when it comes to the conflict in Israel, because we are unable to be critical. But more important than that, it begs the question of whether Britain, Europe, and the United States of America have effectively now finally destroyed for all time the rule of international law. And this will be most heavily felt in the way in which it manufactures, distributes, and uses its weaponry. And unfortunately, the consequences for that are going to be felt in places like the occupied territories, in Africa, in South and Southeast Asia, these parts of the world, in Latin and South America, these parts of the world where we cause such damage anyway. With Israel having done what it's done without criticism from the Western world, it is going to be open season in all of these places. And at some point, probably sometime soon, it is going to come home to roost in what Chalmers Johnson described as inevitable blowback.